In the early years of the 20th century, the world appeared to be moving confidently toward a future of progress and stability. Cities were growing, industries were booming, and new inventions like automobiles, telephones, and airplanes were transforming everyday life. Many people believed that major wars between powerful nations were a thing of the past, made impossible by diplomacy, trade, and shared economic interests. Europe, in particular, stood at the center of this optimism. Great empires ruled vast territories, kings and emperors were connected through family ties, and international conferences promised peace and cooperation. Yet beneath this calm surface, deep tensions were building. Nations were competing aggressively for power, prestige, and survival. Armies were expanding, weapons were becoming deadlier, and alliances were quietly turning Europe into a tightly wound trap. All it needed was a single spark. That spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated. What seemed at first like a shocking but local event soon unleashed a chain reaction that no leader could stop. Within weeks, declarations of war spread across Europe, and the world was pulled into a conflict that would become known as World War I. This was not just another war. It was the beginning of a new and terrifying era in human history. World War I was unlike any conflict that had come before it. For the first time, industrial power was fully harnessed for destruction. Factories that once produced consumer goods were converted to manufacture weapons, ammunition, and military equipment on an unprecedented scale. Entire societies were mobilized for war, with governments controlling economies, media, and daily life. Millions of men were called to fight, while women took on new roles in factories, farms, and hospitals. The battlefield itself was transformed. Instead of short, decisive battles, soldiers found themselves trapped in endless trench networks stretching hundreds of miles. New weapons such as machine guns, poison gas, heavy artillery, submarines, and tanks turned warfare into a brutal test of endurance. Death came not only from bullets, but from disease, hunger, and psychological trauma. By the time the war ended in 1918, more than 16 million people were dead, and countless others were wounded or permanently scarred. Entire regions lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and the belief in inevitable human progress was shattered. To understand how the world reached this point, it is essential to look beyond the assassination that started the war and examine the deeper forces that made such a catastrophe possible. At its core, World War I was the result of long-standing tensions that had been building for decades. Europe was dominated by powerful nations that viewed international relations as a constant struggle for advantage. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, sought recognition as a global power and challenged the dominance of Britain and France. Britain, the world's leading naval and colonial power, feared any threat to its supremacy. France, still haunted by its defeat to Germany in 1871, longed to regain lost territory and restore its national pride. Austria-Hungary struggled to hold together its diverse empire, while Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe. These rival ambitions created an atmosphere of suspicion and competition, where compromise was seen as weakness and military strength as the ultimate guarantee of security. Instead of reducing tensions, this mindset encouraged nations to prepare constantly for war, making conflict more likely rather than less. One of the most dangerous forces shaping this period was militarism. European powers invested enormous resources into building massive armies and powerful navies. Military leaders gained significant influence over political decisions, and war planning became a central part of national policy. Detailed strategies were developed for rapid mobilization, leaving little room for diplomacy once a crisis began. The belief was simple but flawed. A strong military would deter enemies and prevent war. In reality, it created a situation where nations felt pressured to act quickly and aggressively, fearing that hesitation would leave them at a disadvantage. When the crisis of 1914 erupted, These rigid military plans pushed countries toward war at a speed that politicians could not control. Mobilization schedules became deadlines, and diplomacy was overtaken by the logic of force. Alliances further intensified this dangerous situation. By the early 20th century, Europe was divided into two major alliance systems. On one side stood the Triple Entente, made up of Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side was the Triple Alliance, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These alliances were originally intended to maintain balance and deter aggression, but they had the opposite effect. A dispute involving one country now risked drawing in multiple great powers. What might have remained a local conflict instead became a test of loyalty and credibility. Leaders feared that abandoning an ally would weaken their position and invite future threats. As a result, alliances turned diplomatic crises into automatic escalations, setting the stage for a general war. Imperialism also played a major role in fueling tensions. European powers competed fiercely for colonies and resources across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. These overseas empires were symbols of national prestige and sources of economic strength. Rivalries over colonial territories increased hostility and mistrust, particularly between Germany and the established colonial powers of Britain and France. Although many colonial disputes were resolved peacefully, they left behind resentment and a sense of injustice. The competition for global influence reinforced the belief that the world was divided into winners and losers, and that only the strongest nations would survive. This zero-sum view of international politics made cooperation increasingly difficult. Nationalism was perhaps the most powerful and unpredictable force of all. In Western Europe, nationalism strengthened loyalty to the state and encouraged citizens to support military expansion. In Eastern and Southeastern Europe, however, nationalism took a different form. Many ethnic groups living within large empires sought independence and self-rule. The Balkans became a particularly volatile region, where declining Ottoman influence, rising Serbian nationalism, and Austro-Hungarian fears collided. Serbia, backed by Russia, emerged as a focal point of Slavic nationalism, while Austria-Hungary viewed this movement as a direct threat to its survival. It was in this tense environment that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand took place. The act was carried out by a nationalist who believed that violence was justified in the pursuit of independence. Yet the assassination was only the trigger, not the cause, of the war that followed. When Austria-Hungary responded by issuing an ultimatum to Serbia, the complex system of alliances and military plans quickly came into play. Diplomatic efforts failed, mobilizations began, and within weeks, Europe was at war. What made this moment so tragic was that many leaders believed the war would be short and decisive. They expected a quick victory that would strengthen their nations and restore stability. Instead, they unleashed a conflict that spiraled beyond their control. The war spread far beyond Europe, drawing in colonies and nations from around the globe. It reshaped societies, economies, and political systems in ways that no one had anticipated. Understanding the hook and introduction of World War I is not just about recounting how the war started. It is about recognizing how fragile peace can be when fear, ambition, and rivalry dominate international relations. The war was not inevitable, but it became possible because of the choices nations made over many years. Those choices created a world where cooperation was weak, trust was scarce, and violence was seen as a legitimate tool of policy. World War I stands as a powerful warning from history, showing how quickly progress can turn into destruction when humanity fails to manage its divisions. The war that began in 1914 did more than end millions of lives. It reshaped the modern world, leaving consequences that would echo throughout the 20th century and beyond. As the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world that emerged from World War I was forever changed. The war ended, but its scars remained etched into nations, families, and the global order itself. Empires that had ruled for centuries collapsed, new countries were born, and millions of people were left struggling to rebuild their lives in a shattered world. The optimism and confidence that once defined the early 20th century were replaced by grief, anger, and uncertainty. Although the fighting stopped, the problems that led to the war were not fully resolved. Harsh peace settlements, economic hardship, and unresolved nationalist tensions planted the seeds for future conflict. World War I was meant to be the war to end all wars, yet its legacy proved how fragile peace can be when lessons are ignored. More than a century later, the First World War still speaks to us. It reminds us how quickly diplomacy can fail, how dangerous unchecked nationalism and militarism can become, and how ordinary people often pay the highest price for political decisions made far above them. Remembering World War I is not only about honoring those who lived and died during it, but about understanding the responsibility that comes with power and choice. History shows us that peace is not guaranteed, it must be protected, nurtured, and learned from. The story of World War I stands as a warning and a lesson, urging future generations to choose dialogue over destruction and cooperation over conflict.